Emma stood frozen in the doorway of the sunlit bistro, staring in disbelief as wave after wave of guests flooded inside. Friends, neighbors, even near strangers whose lives she had quietly touched. Across town, her mother-in-law's grand party, the one Emma had been deliberately excluded from, was unraveling into a humiliating disaster. Emma hadn't lifted a finger in revenge, and yet fate itself seemed to be answering for her. But what happened next would shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. When Emma Caldwell said her vows to Mark under the golden arch of autumn trees, she believed she was marrying into a family, a messy, imperfect, but ultimately loving one. She had grown up without much of a support system, and the idea of inherited holidays, overlapping birthdays, and Sunday dinners had been a kind of dream. She was willing to work for it, to earn her place. From the start, Janet Caldwell made it clear she would not make it easy. Janet was the kind of woman who carved up affection like a rare delicacy, distributing it sparingly to those she deemed worthy. A woman whose praise was a trickle and whose judgment flowed like a river. Mark, her only son, floated downstream without question, and Emma, despite her best efforts, kept finding herself swimming against a current she hadn't expected to be so strong. Still, Emma persisted. She brought warm pecan pies to 4th of July barbecues, even when Janet barely acknowledged them. She stayed late at charity auctions, helping count silent auction bids while Janet barked orders. She sat by Janet's bedside when pneumonia knocked the woman low for weeks, a time when even her own sisters made excuses not to visit. Emma thought she was building something solid, laying bricks of loyalty and patience into a foundation they could someday stand on together. But every smile from Janet came too late. Every thank you was stiff, the words brittle like dry twigs. Emma convinced herself it was just a matter of time, that if she kept loving harder, louder, more selflessly, Janet would have no choice but to fold her into the family quilt. The truth fell into Emma's lap on a Tuesday afternoon, as casually as a grocery receipt fluttering to the floor. Their neighbor, Mrs. Halloway, mentioned it while pulling weeds along the sidewalk. "A big party," she said. "Janet's 65th. Everyone would be there. Everyone. Except Emma." Emma laughed politely, pretending she already knew, that her invitation must have been lost. But the laugh tasted sour in her mouth. That evening, after dinner, Emma sat across from Mark at their scarred oak kitchen table, the silence between them thick and coiled. She waited for him to explain, to apologize, to offer anything. Instead, he shrugged. His voice was low, almost embarrassed. "It's easier this way. She just wants it to be family." The words landed like stones against her ribs. Family. What was she then? A tenant? Emma stared at him, her chest rising and falling in tight, shallow breaths. Anger flickered at the edge of her mind, but it couldn't yet find oxygen. There was only disbelief, spreading cold and slow through her veins. She stood from the table without a word, the chair scraping loudly against the hardwood, and walked to the window. The street outside blurred, city lights smearing into streaks through the tears she refused to let fall. It wasn't about missing a dinner party. It was the brutal, silent decree. You don't belong, and no one here is going to fight for you. And for the first time since she had entered the Caldwell family, Emma understood exactly where she stood. Alone. The days that followed sat on Emma's chest like heavy stones. She moved through the house like a ghost, completing tasks on autopilot, folding laundry, answering emails, stirring pasta. She had no appetite to eat. Mark noticed, in the way a man notices a cold draft, uncomfortable but not enough to move. He offered no words, no arms, no shelter. The betrayal had opened a raw, pulsing wound inside Emma that throbbed with every beat of her heart. Not just Janet's exclusion, but Mark's silent complicity. If he wouldn't even defend her now, what loyalty could she expect in the years ahead? The life she had imagined, laughter around family tables, grandchildren bouncing between generations, flickered and burned out in the back of her mind like the last wick of a dying candle. At night, she lay awake, staring into the darkness, her chest aching with the weight of the unspoken. The sadness was thick at first, swallowing everything, but slowly, something harder formed underneath it, a bitter steel taking shape in her bones. By the third day, the sadness began to curdle into anger. Not the kind of hot, reckless anger that burns out quickly. No, this was a slow, calculating anger, a deep and stubborn fire that demanded action. They wanted to pretend she didn't exist? Fine. She would show them exactly what they chose to discard. Emma sat at the small writing desk tucked into the corner of the living room, her fingers hovering over her laptop keyboard. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She simply acted, moving from instinct as pure and sure as breathing. The email she composed was short. No bitterness, no explanations, just an invitation. Bright, open, welcoming. Come celebrate life with me this Saturday afternoon at the Willow Creek Bistro. No gifts, no expectations. Just bring yourself and your smile. No mention of birthdays. No mention of Janet or Mark or family politics. It was a message sewn from dignity, stitched together with quiet defiance. She combed through her contacts, former co-workers, neighbors who had waved to her over the hedges for years, acquaintances from book clubs and volunteer shifts. Each name she added felt like a stitch closing an old wound. People who had seen her kindness, her efforts, even when her own family had turned a blind eye. When the final email sent, Emma leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The fear was there, fluttering like a moth in her chest. What if no one came? What if she ended up sitting alone at a table set for 20, exposed in her foolishness? But beneath the fear, something else had taken root. Hope. Small, fragile, but alive. For the first time in days, Emma smiled. Not the brittle, strained smile she wore for appearances, but something real, something born from the simple, stubborn belief that she deserved to be celebrated. Not by force, not by blood ties, by choice. And whatever happened next, Emma knew one thing for certain. She would no longer beg for a place at someone else's table. She would build her own. The sun crawled over Willow Creek in a cold, brittle light, but Maple Street was already awake. It started with a single car pulling up along the curb. Then another. And another. By 8 a.m., pickup trucks lined both sides of the road, some with American flags whipping from their beds, others with hand-painted signs propped against their tailgates. People spilled from vehicles, men and women of all ages, some wrapped in thick coats, some still in work uniforms, some old, leaning on canes or crutches, but all moving with the same hard purpose. At the heart of it all sat Walter Jennings. Still on his battered suitcase, still bundled against the cold, still holding Buddy's leash in hands that trembled more now from shock than from age. His faded blue eyes flickered with confusion as strangers knelt beside him, offering coffee, blankets, folding chairs. Someone draped a heavy Marine Corps blanket across his shoulders, the bold eagle and anchor stitched in bright gold thread. Walter tried to speak, to protest, to say he didn't want to trouble anyone, but the words crumbled into the freezing air, swallowed by the rising murmur of voices that grew louder, stronger, angrier. At 9:30, local news crews arrived. Cameras rolled, reporters jostling for the best shot, their microphones catching fragments of outrage from the swelling crowd. "This man fought for us, and now he's tossed out like garbage? Where's the honor we pretend to have? We're not letting him freeze out here another night. By 10 o'clock, the street was impassable. Hundreds of people packed Maple Street shoulder to shoulder. Teachers, farmers, truckers, veterans in full-dress blues, teenagers with flags painted on their cheeks. A wall of humanity stretched from Walter's front gate to the end of the block. When Todd Simmons finally arrived, late and irritated, his gleaming black SUV had to slow to a crawl. He leaned out the window, shouting for people to move, flashing a fake smile as he realized cameras were everywhere. But no one moved. Instead, as Todd opened his car door, a figure stepped forward. Jack Collins, retired police chief, a man whose badge had once held this town together when tempers ran hot. Jack stood tall despite the years bending his back, his voice carrying sharp and clear over the stunned crowd. "You come one step closer to that man," Jack said, pointing directly at Todd. "And you'll have to go through every last one of us." A ripple of agreement surged through the crowd. Not a roar, but something more dangerous. A low, rolling wave of unity, heavy and immovable. Todd's mouth opened and closed. His hands fluttered in helpless anger. Cameras zeroed in, capturing every twitch of his face, every drop of sweat gathering on his carefully moisturized forehead. He tried to argue, to bluff, but the wall of faces, the flags, the fierce silence that met his words swallowed him whole. Todd Simmons retreated, slammed the car door, backed down the street in reverse, jeered by 100 quiet, determined eyes. The sun rose higher, glittering on the snow, on the banners, on the proud tears running down Walter's weathered cheeks. The rising tide had become a flood, and there was no stopping it now. The party carried on into the late afternoon, each hour folding into the next like a soft, timeless hymn. Emma floated through the room, pulled from conversation to conversation, her cheeks aching from the genuine, effortless smiles she couldn't suppress. People shared stories she had long forgotten. The time she drove a neighbor's dog to the emergency vet at midnight, the evening she sat for hours with a grieving co-worker, the way she always remembered to ask about small things others overlooked. Her kindness had left fingerprints everywhere, invisible until now. When the gathering finally began to thin, Emma stood near the windows, watching the sunlight stretch in long, golden bars across the floor. Her heart felt full to the point of breaking, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she had never truly been invisible. She had simply been looking for validation in the wrong place. Her phone buzzed inside her purse. She let it ring, the screen lighting up with Mark's name, then Janet's, then Mark again. Emma didn't need to answer to know the contents of those messages. The brittle, defensive anger of people realizing too late that they had miscalculated. At Janet's grand event, the carefully curated guest list had unraveled. People made excuses, found better places to be, drifted away from the chill that clung to Janet like a second skin. There would be no grand toasts, no cascading laughter, no triumphant memories to mark her milestone. Only the thin, bitter echo of her own exclusivity bouncing back at her. Emma's absence had been louder than any confrontation, and it was glorious. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, the crispness filling her lungs, Emma realized there would be no going back to the way things were. She had crossed an invisible bridge and burned it behind her without regret. The town square bustled in the distance, families gathering, teenagers laughing by the fountain. Life pulsed on, vast and indifferent to one woman's rejection. Emma didn't need an apology. She didn't need a seat at someone else's table. She had built her own, and it was sturdy, worn smooth by laughter and love, polished by the hands of those who had chosen her freely. With one last look back at the glowing windows of the bistro, Emma smiled. A real, unbreakable smile that stretched deep into her soul. She walked toward the setting sun, alone but never lonely. Because in the end, she had not been cast out. She had simply risen above.